The panic attack began beneath artificial stars. Elia's ward stood motionless inside the 43rd-floor conference hall of Helix Financial Group, while hundreds of suspended crystal lights glittered above him like a manufactured galaxy. Through the massive glass walls surrounding the room, Manhattan stretched endlessly into the night, an ocean of illuminated windows, cold steel towers, and blinking advertisements promising happiness to people too exhausted to question what happiness even meant anymore. Inside the hall, executives were applauding. Outside, somewhere far below, rain-soaked homeless men sleeping beneath digital billboards selling luxury watches worth more than a year of rent. Elias could hear the applause echoing around him, sharp and empty like metal striking metal. A giant presentation screen glowed at the center of the room. Q4 profits exceed expectations. The room erupted again. Champagne glasses clinked. Perfect white smiles appeared beneath designer suits. Meanwhile, 200 employees had been terminated earlier that morning through automated email notifications generated by artificial intelligence software Elias himself had helped optimize 6 months ago. Efficiency restructuring, they called it. He stared at the smiling faces around him and suddenly felt detached from his own body, as if his soul had stepped several feet backward and was quietly observing the performance from a distance. His chest tightened. Not now. He forced a breath into his lungs. The air smelled of expensive perfume, polished marble, and overheated electronics. Everything looked flawless. Everything felt dead. Beside him, his coworker Daniel laughed while scrolling through stock charts on his phone. 3 more years, Daniel muttered excitedly. Then I'm out. Miami house, private yacht. Real life finally starts. Elias looked at him carefully. Daniel had said the exact same sentence last year, and the year before that. Almost everyone in the office spoke like prisoners counting imaginary days until freedom. Yet nobody ever seemed to leave. Across the room, another executive raised a glass. To sacrifice, he announced proudly. That's what separates winners from ordinary people. More applause. Elias felt his pulse rising faster. The giant digital screen shifted again. Now a sleek corporate slogan appeared in silver lettering across black background. Winning is everything. Something inside him cracked. For a split second, the room became strangely distorted. The lights too bright, the sounds too distant, the people moving like synchronized machines repeating behaviors they no longer understood. Then came the memory. He was 10 years old again, rain leaking through the apartment ceiling, his mother silently pretending she had already eaten dinner so he could have the last sandwich. His father sitting at the kitchen table staring at unpaid bills with hollow eyes before finally whispering, "If you are not rich in this country, son, nobody sees you." At the time, Elias believed him. America itself seemed to believe him. Schools believed it. Advertisements believed it. Politicians believed it. Every screen, every commercial, every influencer, every billionaire interview repeated the same message in different forms. Become rich, become desirable, become successful, or disappear. The panic attack hit fully. Elias loosened his tie, breathing harder now. Sweat gathered beneath his collar despite the freezing air conditioning. No one noticed. That terrified him most. Hundreds of people surrounded him, yet nobody could see another human being collapsing 2 feet away, because everyone was too busy performing success. He quietly stepped away from the crowd and entered the restroom corridor outside the hall. The sound of applause became muffled behind the walls. He leaned against the sink, gripping the marble counter tightly. The mirror reflected a face he barely recognized anymore. 30 years old, expensive suit, dark circles beneath exhausted eyes. A man who had spent his entire life climbing towards something he no longer understood. His smartwatch vibrated again. Another work email. Another productivity reminder. Another algorithm demanding another piece of his existence. Elias suddenly wanted silence more desperately than money. Across the city, Sophia Bennett sat inside another tower of glass and steel overlooking Times Square. Endless digital advertisements flashed below her office windows like hypnotic commandments. Buy. Upgrade, become. Desire. She stared numbly at the luxury campaign presentation glowing across her monitor. A beautiful woman wearing a diamond watch smiled beside the slogan. Sophia herself had written 3 weeks earlier. Become the person they envy. The campaign had tested extremely well psychologically. Their analytics department discovered the advertisement triggered insecurity patterns in women between 25 and 42 with frightening efficiency. Insecurity generated engagement. Engagement generated consumption. Consumption generated profit. Sophia knew exactly how the machine worked because she helped build it every day. Brilliant emotional targeting, her supervisor said proudly during the meeting. This campaign makes people feel incomplete without the product. That's powerful branding. Everyone nodded approvingly. Sophia forced a smile while nausea twisted quietly inside her stomach. After the meeting ended, she remained seated alone in the conference room long after everyone left. Below the tower, thousands of strangers moved through the streets carrying coffee cups, shopping bags, glowing phones. Every face looked tired. Every movement rushed, every expression distracted. Suddenly Sophia imagined the city as one enormous invisible conveyor belt, carrying millions of people toward destinations none of them had consciously chosen. Her phone vibrated. The nursing home. For a moment she nearly ignored it. Work still waited. Deadlines still waited. Productivity still waited. Everything always waited except life itself. By the time she arrived at the nursing home, evening shadows stretched across the parking lot. The building smelled faintly of medicine, old paper, and loneliness. A television flickered softly in the corner lounge, where several elderly residents sat staring blankly at game shows they probably weren't even watching. Sophia's grandmother had died 3 days earlier, heart failure, age 82. The staff spoke kindly but hurriedly, understaffed, underfunded, exhausted. Sophia entered her grandmother's small room and froze. The bed was already empty, cleaned, prepared for the next resident, an entire human life erased in less than 72 hours. On the bedside table rested a folded drawing Sophia had made as a child. Her grandmother had kept it for 20 years. Sophia slowly sat down beside the empty bed and broke, not loudly, not dramatically, just silently, because suddenly she understood something horrifying. Modern society had taught people how to become productive, but not how to love each other. Old people died alone. Children grew emotionally abandoned. Families became fragmented. Everyone chased success while starving spiritually. And somehow civilization called this progress. That night, both Elias and Sophia attended the same elite networking gala hosted inside one of Manhattan's most luxurious hotels. Crystal chandeliers, golden lighting, designer suits, artificial laughter. Every conversation sounded strangely identical. Investments, status, market expansion, personal branding, future wealth. Nobody spoke about peace. Nobody spoke about meaning. Nobody spoke about being happy. Elias wandered through the crowd feeling increasingly disconnected from reality itself. Sophia stood near the balcony listening to two executives casually discuss burnout medication between champagne sips. One of them laughed. Anxiety's good for productivity. Something inside her went cold. Hours later, the event finally ended. Rain poured heavily across the city streets outside. Guests rushed toward black luxury cars, while neon lights reflected across wet pavement like fractured illusions. Elias stepped outside alone, loosening his tie beneath the storm. For the first time all day, the rain felt real, Cold, honest, alive. A few feet away, Sophia stood beneath the hotel awning holding her heels in one hand, rainwater sliding through strands of dark hair as she stared silently at the glowing skyline. For several moments neither spoke, then Elias glanced toward the endless towers surrounding them. "So this is it," he said quietly. Sophia looked at him. "This is what?" He searched for the words. "This thing we all worship." The rain intensified around them. "We spend our whole lives sacrificing ourselves to become successful," Elias continued. "And nobody even stops long enough to ask who taught us what success was supposed to mean." Sophia's expression shifted slightly. Not surprise, recognition. Elias laughed weakly, though there was no humor in it. "I look around and everyone wants the exact same things. The same cars, same status, same dreams, same desires." His voice lowered. "Doesn't that seem strange to you?" Sophia stared at the rain running across the streetlights. For years she had buried the same fear beneath work, schedules, and ambition. Now hearing someone else say it aloud felt almost dangerous. Elias turned toward her fully. His eyes looked exhausted, but awake. "What if none of our desires actually belong to us?" Sophia froze. The city noise faded strangely around her, because deep inside, she had already begun fearing the exact same thing. The city no longer looked alive to Elias Ward. It looked programmed. 3 weeks had passed since the night outside the hotel, yet Sophia's final expression beneath the rain haunted him more than sleep ever could. Not because it was romantic. Because it was recognition. For the first time in his life, another human being had looked at him as though she, too, could hear the hidden machinery beneath society's noise. And once Elias noticed the machine, he could not stop seeing it. Every subway advertisement suddenly felt predatory. Every social media notification resembled psychological bait. Every smiling luxury campaign looked less like inspiration and more like engineered dissatisfaction. One sleepless night, he sat alone inside his apartment surrounded by glowing laptop screens, empty coffee cups, and scattered handwritten notes. Rain tapped softly against the windows while the city outside pulsed with restless electricity. Behavioral economics, consumer psychology, algorithmic emotional prediction, neuromarketing. Dopamine conditioning. He read obsessively for hours, then days, then weeks. The deeper he researched, the more horrifying the patterns became. Corporations were no longer merely selling products. They were engineering emotional dependency. Fear generated clicks, loneliness generated subscriptions, insecurity generated consumption, outrage generated engagement. Human emotion itself had become an extractable resource. Elias leaned back slowly, rubbing exhausted eyes as another research paper glowed across the screen. AI systems could now predict emotional vulnerability with terrifying precision. Algorithms identified when users felt isolated, unattractive, anxious, rejected, or insecure, then delivered perfectly timed advertisements to exploit those emotional states. The machine was no longer selling objects. It was manufacturing desire itself. His phone vibrated beside him, a message from Sophia. "You awake?" Elias stared at the screen for a moment before replying. "I don't think I've been awake until recently." 3 dots appeared, then disappeared, then returned. "Meet me tomorrow after work." The next evening, Sophia brought him to the rooftop of an unfinished parking structure overlooking the city skyline. Cold wind moved through the concrete skeleton of the building. Below them, traffic lights flowed endlessly through Manhattan like streams of artificial blood. Sophia handed him a paper coffee cup. "You look terrible," she said quietly. Elias laughed weakly. "I feel worse." For several moments they stood silently beside each other watching giant digital billboards flash across nearby towers. Buy, upgrade, become, desire. One advertisement showed a smiling couple embracing beside a luxury car beneath the slogan, "You deserve more." Sophia stared at it bitterly. "No," she whispered. "That's the lie." Elias looked at her carefully. She reached into her bag and removed several printed corporate documents, internal marketing reports, psychological segmentation analyses, emotional targeting data. Sophia's voice became quieter. "These are from my company." Elias scanned the pages. One section read, "Consumers experiencing loneliness display 47% higher impulsive luxury spending." Another, "Body insecurity increases engagement duration among female demographics." Another, "Social comparison anxiety significantly boosts repeat platform interaction." Elias felt sick. "They know exactly what they're doing," he muttered. Sophia nodded slowly. "They create emotional wounds, then sell artificial relief." The wind intensified around them. Below, thousands of illuminated apartment windows stretched across the city like isolated cages suspended in darkness. "I used to think advertising reflected society," Sophia said softly. "Now I think it programs society." Elias looked toward the skyline again. For the first time, the skyscrapers no longer resembled monuments of progress. They looked like giant mirrors reflecting humanity's collective emptiness back at itself. That night, Elias walked for hours through the sleeping edges of the city, away from traffic, away from screens, away from noise. Eventually, he reached a narrow riverside trail hidden behind industrial warehouses where the sounds of civilization softened into distant echoes. The air smelled different there. Wet soil, river water, trees, real things. For several minutes he simply stood beneath the dark sky listening to leaves move gently in the wind. No advertisements, no notifications, no performance, just silence. And suddenly his body relaxed, not mentally, physically, as if some invisible pressure gripping his nervous system had finally loosened. Elias slowly sat beneath a tree, overlooking the water. He realized with painful clarity that he could not remember the last time he had experienced genuine peace, without purchasing it artificially through entertainment, distraction, alcohol, or exhaustion. Nature asked for almost nothing. Society demanded everything. The realization nearly broke him. His eyes drifted upward toward the stars barely visible through city haze. As a child, he used to stare at the night sky, wondering about existence itself. Now most adults spent their lives staring downward into glowing rectangles designed to monetize attention. What had humanity become, or worse, what had it allowed itself to become? Sophia changed too, quietly, dangerously. At work she continued performing her role flawlessly, but internally something irreversible had shifted. Every corporate strategy meeting now sounded grotesque to her. Fear converts well. Scarcity increases emotional engagement. Identity insecurity drives retention. They spoke about humans suffering the way engineers discussed machinery. One afternoon, her supervisor proudly presented a new campaign targeting teenage anxiety trends through beauty-driven algorithms. Everyone applauded. Sophia felt cold inside. That evening, she met Elias inside a small second-hand bookstore hidden between old apartment buildings downtown. The place smelled of dust, paper, and aging wood. Unlike the modern city, nothing there screamed for attention. Sophia carried several books beneath her arm: Buddhism, Stoicism, Sufism, Christian mysticism, Taoism. Elias looked surprised. "You study all of them." "I study what human beings once believed before the world turned consumption into religion." They sat together near the back corner while soft jazz played quietly overhead. Sophia opened one of the books gently. "Different religions," she said, "but almost all of them eventually arrive at similar truths." Elias listened silently. "Simplicity." She turned another page. "Compassion," another. "Detachment from greed," another. "Service to others." She looked at him carefully. None of them worship endless consumption. The words settled deeply inside him. Outside, neon lights flickered through the bookstore windows like artificial stars, competing against something ancient and invisible. Sophia smiled faintly. You know what scares me? What? That modern society calls spiritually exhausted people successful. Elias lowered his gaze, because he knew she was describing both of them. Weeks passed. Their conversations deepened, not romantic in the ordinary sense, something rarer. They spoke like two people trying to remember a forgotten language buried beneath modern life. Sometimes they walked silently through parks discussing philosophy. Sometimes they sat inside cheap diners watching exhausted workers stare numbly into phones, while television screamed financial news overhead. Sometimes they simply shared silence. And somehow silence itself began healing them. Online, strange things also started happening. Anonymous discussion forums began sharing fragments of Elias' writings about artificial desire and emotional manipulation. Sophia anonymously leaked small pieces of internal branding research. The posts spread quietly at first, then rapidly. Thousands of strangers responded with disturbing emotional honesty. I thought I was the only one feeling this emptiness. Why does modern life feel spiritually fake? I make six figures and still feel emotionally dead. Nobody talks about this. The loneliness was collective. That realization terrified Elias more than anything. Because if millions secretly felt the same emptiness, then society itself might already be psychologically collapsing beneath the surface. But awakening carried consequences. At Helix Financial Group, Elias noticed unusual behavior from management. Conversations stopped when he entered rooms. Access permissions changed unexpectedly. One afternoon, his supervisor casually asked, "You seem distracted lately, Elias. Everything okay?" The question sounded polite. The eyes did not. Meanwhile, Sophia's coworkers began mocking her philosophical shifts. "You're getting weird lately. You used to be ambitious. Don't tell me you're becoming anti-success." Anti-success. As though questioning emotional slavery itself had become irrational. Even their families noticed. Elias' father stared at him during dinner one night with visible frustration. "You're finally financially stable," he said. "Why are you suddenly talking like this? People would kill for your position." Elias looked around the small dining room quietly, his exhausted mother. Bills stacked near the refrigerator, television advertisements screaming from the living room, and despite decades of sacrifice, nobody there looked happy. "What if stability isn't the same thing as living?" Elias asked softly. His father said nothing, because somewhere deep down he already knew. Late one evening, Sophia returned home exhausted after another brutal workday, manipulating emotional data for luxury branding campaigns she increasingly despised. Her apartment looked beautiful. Minimalist furniture, floor-to-ceiling windows, expensive lighting, absolute emptiness. She stood silently before the bathroom mirror staring at her own reflection. For years she had carefully built an identity designed to look successful. Now she barely recognized the woman staring back. Her phone vibrated. Unknown encrypted sender. No number attached. Sophia frowned and opened the message. Only one sentence appeared on the screen. "Lucien Vale knows you're asking dangerous questions." The blood drained from her face. Outside her apartment window, the city lights continued glowing endlessly. Beautiful, artificial, and suddenly terrifying. The first time Elias Ward saw Lucien Vale speak, the entire world seemed hypnotized. Massive digital screens across Manhattan displayed Lucien's face, towering above traffic-clogged streets, and exhausted pedestrians hurrying beneath endless advertisements. In airports, cafes, elevators, office lobbies, and apartment televisions, the same interview played repeatedly like a sermon broadcast by modern civilization itself. Lucien smiled calmly beneath soft studio lighting. Perfect suit, perfect posture, perfect confidence. The interviewer laughed nervously while asking, "What do you believe is humanity's greatest strength?" Lucien folded his hands thoughtfully. "Desire," he answered smoothly. Human progress depends entirely on dissatisfaction. The moment people stop craving more, civilization stops evolving. The audience applauded. Elias watched from the break room television at Helix Financial while coworkers nodded approvingly around him. But something inside him tightened, because Lucien did not speak like a businessman. He spoke like a man who understood humanity psychologically, dangerously psychologically. On the television screen, Lucien continued. "People claim they want peace, simplicity, connection," he said gently. "But history proves otherwise. Humanity desires stimulation, competition, escapism, consumption. We merely provide what people already crave." Again applause. Elias looked around the room slowly. Coffee cups, sleep-deprived faces, artificial smiles. Everyone absorbing Lucien's words without resistance. Not because they fully believed him, because they were too exhausted to question him. That evening rain drifted softly across the city, while Sophia sat beside Elias inside a dim, underground archive room hidden beneath an abandoned community church downtown. Stacks of leaked corporate documents surrounded them, behavioral prediction systems, emotional mapping algorithms, AI-driven consumer influence programs. What they discovered over the past month had evolved far beyond targeted advertising. This was civilization-scale psychological engineering. Sophia rubbed tired eyes while scrolling through encrypted files on her laptop. "Look at this," she whispered. Elias leaned closer. One internal Lucien Vale Corporation report read, "Long-term emotional dependency increases economic predictability." Another, "Spiritually fulfilled populations display reduced luxury consumption patterns." Another, "Community-centered living models weaken algorithmic behavioral influence." Elias stared silently. The implications were monstrous. Modern systems did not merely profit from loneliness. They required it. Sophia's voice trembled slightly. "They know emotionally connected people consume less." Elias nodded slowly. "And isolated people are easier to manipulate." The old church above them creaked softly as wind moved through broken stained glass windows. Dust floated through dim golden light while distant traffic hummed beyond underground walls. For several moments neither spoke. Finally Sophia whispered, "What if civilization itself became an industry?" Elias looked at her carefully. "What do you mean?" she swallowed. "What if human emptiness became the most profitable resource on Earth?" The silence afterward felt sacred and terrifying at the same time, because deep down, both already knew the answer. The healing communities began almost accidentally. At first it was just dinners. Small gatherings inside borrowed apartments where strangers shared homemade food without phones, advertisements, networking agendas, or performative success rituals. No influencers, no status games, no productivity talk, just human conversation, real conversation. At the first gathering, people spoke awkwardly at first, as though they had forgotten how to exist without social performance. Then something softened. A divorced schoolteacher cried quietly while describing how she had not eaten dinner with another human being in almost 8 months. A former software engineer admitted he earned 6 figures, but secretly drank himself to sleep every night because he no longer understood why he was alive. An exhausted nurse confessed she sometimes sat in parking lots after work, unable to emotionally process modern life anymore. Nobody mocked vulnerability there. Nobody sold solutions. People simply listened, and somehow that alone began healing something invisible. The gatherings expanded rapidly afterward. Nature retreats followed. Old campsites abandoned outside the city slowly transformed into quiet sanctuaries, where burned-out strangers walked through forests without constant digital noise poisoning their nervous systems. Elias watched people rediscover silence like starving souls tasting water after years in a desert. Children laughed without screens. Old people told stories beside fires. Strangers hugged each other sincerely. Birdsong replaced notification sounds. At night, Sophia sometimes stood watching everyone from a distance beneath moonlit trees, tears quietly gathering in her eyes. "What?" Elias asked one evening. She smiled faintly. "I forgot humanity could still look like this." The firelight reflected softly across exhausted faces, slowly becoming alive again. Not richer, alive. The orphan support network came next. Then elderly care sanctuaries. Then cooperative living spaces where people pooled resources instead of destroying themselves, competing endlessly for isolated survival. The movement spread quietly through encrypted online communities. No official leader, no political slogans, no ideology beyond one dangerous question. What if modern life is making us spiritually sick? The phrase spread everywhere. Underground forums, anonymous videos, hidden podcasts, late-night discussions between exhausted strangers. And then came the sentence that ignited something larger. Maybe we were never supposed to live like this. Nobody knew who originally wrote it. Yet millions seem to feel it already waiting inside themselves. But systems built on emotional dependency do not tolerate awakening peacefully. Media attacks began first. Major news channels started discussing a concerning anti-progress emotional movement, encouraging citizens to reject ambition and productivity. Pundits mocked Elias and Sophia's ideas without naming them directly. Romanticized anti-capitalist escapism, psychological regression, dangerous collectivist spirituality, one televised psychologist declared. Humans require aspirational consumption for emotional stability. Sophia nearly laughed watching it. Because emotional instability was exactly what modern systems had already produced. Then surveillance intensified. Elias noticed unfamiliar men lingering near community gatherings. Phones behaved strangely. Encrypted channels experienced breaches. Banking activity became delayed. One elderly volunteer suddenly lost healthcare benefits after publicly supporting the movement online. The message was subtle, but clear: return to the machine, or suffer outside it. One night, Elias walked alone through Manhattan after another media attack went viral across corporate platforms. Towering screens flooded the city with luxury campaigns, celebrity distractions, outrage-driven headlines, and pharmaceutical advertisements promising relief from anxiety, the same civilization helped create. The streets glowed artificially beneath neon reflections and endless digital stimulation. Yet despite millions surrounding him, the city felt emotionally vacant. Like a giant machine simulating human civilization without understanding the human soul itself. Then he noticed something strange: birds. A small flock crossing silently above the skyscrapers beneath the dark clouds. Free, unbranded, unproductive. For several seconds, Elias stopped walking entirely. The birds disappeared into darkness beyond the city skyline toward unseen forests outside civilization's reach. Something ancient moved inside him then. Not rebellion, recognition. Human beings were never designed to live imprisoned beneath permanent psychological stimulation. The realization filled him equally with peace and rage. Because once seen, it could never be unseen again. Sophia found him hours later sitting beside the river where they had once spoken during their earliest awakening. Cold wind moved across the water while distant skyscrapers shimmered like artificial constellations behind them. "You're angry," she said softly. Elias didn't deny it. "They're destroying people." Sophia sat beside him quietly. "Anger won't heal them. He looked away. But maybe it's necessary. She studied him carefully beneath the pale city glow. For the first time since meeting him, Sophia saw something dangerous growing beneath Elia's compassion. Not cruelty, conviction. A man emotionally awakening inside a civilization, designed to suppress awakening at all costs. That kind of person frightened systems, because such people eventually stopped obeying invisible rules. Sophia gently touched his hand. If we become consumed by hatred, she whispered, then the system already wins. Elias closed his eyes briefly. The river moved quietly before them. And somewhere beyond the poisoned noise of civilization, he still believed humanity could remember itself. 3 days later, the invitation arrived. No sender, no return address. Only a black envelope delivered directly to Elia's apartment door. Inside rested a single card embossed with silver lettering. Lucien Vale requests your company. Below it, tomorrow, midnight. Elias stared at the card for several silent moments. Sophia read it twice before speaking. This is dangerous. He knows everything already, Elias replied quietly. Outside the apartment windows, thunder rolled softly above the sleeping city. The meeting took place atop one of Lucien Vale's private skyscrapers overlooking Manhattan. The office felt less like a workplace and more like a throne room built for modern civilization itself. Floor-to-ceiling glass walls surrounded them. The city glowed beneath like a digital empire. Lucien stood beside the window calmly holding a glass of wine. He looked older in person, not weak, ancient, like a man who understood too much about humanity. Elias Ward, he said warmly. You're becoming difficult to ignore. Elias remained standing. You're monitoring us. Lucien smiled faintly. You say that as though modern life itself isn't built on observation. The room fell silent. Lucien gestured toward the city below. Do you know what people truly fear? He asked quietly. Elias said nothing. Stillness, Lucien answered himself. Silence, meaning. Human beings claim they want freedom, connection, spirituality. His expression darkened slightly. But historically, they run from those things. He stepped closer slowly. Loneliness creates consumers. Insecurity creates ambition. Emptiness creates economic momentum. Elias felt anger rising again. You engineered suffering. Lucien shook his head gently. No, his eyes sharpened. Humanity begged us to distract them. Lightning illuminated the skyline behind him. Lucien's voice became colder. We only perfected the system they desired. The first riots began beneath advertising screens. Not political riots, not ideological riots, emotional riots. A woman walked into the center of a luxury shopping district in Chicago and began screaming at strangers through tears, asking why everyone looked so empty. A delivery driver in Seattle abandoned his truck in the middle of traffic and vanished into the mountains after posting a 6-second video. I don't remember what happiness feels like anymore. In New York, exhausted office workers silently left skyscrapers during lunch breaks and never returned. In Los Angeles, therapy clinics overflowed for months. Prescription antidepressants disappeared from pharmacies faster than food during storms. Across the country, entire apartment buildings remained illuminated deep into the night, not with parties or laughter, but with sleepless people staring blankly into glowing screens, unable to explain why life felt increasingly unbearable. For decades, society had survived by keeping emotional collapse private. Now collapse had become collective and impossible to hide. Rain hammered against the windows of Elias Ward's sanctuary headquarters as hundreds of live feeds flickered across the dark conference room walls. Fires burned in several cities. Protesters marched carrying signs that read, "We are not machines. We were never meant to live alone. Why does survival cost a soul?" The media called it psychological contagion. Governments called it destabilization. Corporations called it economic sabotage, but Elias knew what it truly was. Human exhaustion had finally reached its breaking point. He stood silently near the glass wall, overlooking the sanctuary courtyard below. Families shared meals beneath covered lanterns despite the storm. Elderly people sat beside orphaned children telling stories, while volunteers carried blankets between tables. Simple things, human things. Yet beyond the sanctuary walls, the world behaved as though kindness itself had become revolutionary. Behind him, screens flashed images of Lucien Vale speaking calmly during a global economic summit. The collapse of modern identity structures, Lucien said smoothly, would create catastrophic emotional instability. Civilization depends on aspiration, competition, and productivity. Remove those systems too quickly and humanity risks psychological implosion. Applause followed. Elias muted the screen. Sophia entered quietly carrying 2 cups of tea. She looked exhausted. The past few months had carved visible strain into her face, but her eyes still carried warmth untouched by fear. "You haven't slept," she said softly. "Neither have you." She handed him the tea. Outside, thunder rolled across the city skyline. The distant skyscrapers looked ghostly through the rain, massive monuments of glass and light, standing over millions of emotionally starving people. Sophia watched the courtyard below. "They're calling us dangerous now," she whispered. Elias gave a tired smile. "They called empathy dangerous long before us." But even he no longer fully recognized the movement growing around them. What began as small healing communities had evolved into something much larger. Entire neighborhoods were abandoning hyperconsumer lifestyles. People pooled money to buy shared farmland. Young professionals left prestigious jobs to join collective housing networks. Families reopened multi-generational homes. Volunteers converted abandoned corporate buildings into free emotional recovery centers. The movement spread because it offered something society had quietly stolen: belonging, and the system was panicking. Sophia sat beside him. "We're losing control of the narrative," she admitted. "Some groups are becoming extreme." Elias closed his eyes briefly. He had seen the footage: masked activists vandalizing financial districts, radical groups threatening executives, angry young followers treating Elias like a revolutionary icon instead of a human being. That terrified him more than Lucien ever had. Because movements built from pain could easily become movements built from hatred, and hatred always consumed its creators first. "We wanted healing," Elias said quietly. Sophia looked at him carefully. "Pain doesn't always awaken kindness first." The room fell silent except for distant thunder. Then alarms suddenly erupted downstairs. Elias turned sharply as security staff rushed through the courtyard below. Sophia's face tightened. Another attack. By the time they reached the lower level, smoke already filled portions of the entrance hall. One of the sanctuary transport vans burned outside the gates, while frightened children cried inside nearby rooms. A volunteer stumbled toward them, blood running down his forehead. "They fired into the tires before crashing through the barricade," he gasped. 3 masked men. They escaped. Sophia immediately moved toward the children, while Elias froze beside the burning entrance. The flames reflected in the shattered glass doors like fragments of a dying civilization. Fire, destruction, purification. For one terrifying moment, rage surged through him so violently that it frightened even himself. He wanted retaliation. He wanted to expose names, destroy companies, crush those responsible. And that realization horrified him. Because for the first time, Elias understood how easily wounded people became tyrants while believing they were saving humanity. Sophia returned carrying a frightened little girl wrapped in a blanket. The child buried her face into Sophia's shoulder while trembling violently. The sight shattered the anger inside him. Not erased it, but transformed it. Sophia looked directly at him. We cannot become another machine built from fear. Hours later, the sanctuary held an emergency gathering beneath dim lantern light while rain continued falling outside. Hundreds sat together in silence. Young workers, exhausted parents, elderly refugees from abandoned nursing facilities, children rescued from broken foster systems. People discarded by a civilization obsessed with productivity. Elias stood before them uncertainly. For the first time since the movement began, he did not know what to say. Because the world outside was collapsing faster than anyone anticipated. Supply chains failed as millions abandoned meaningless work. Corporate trust disintegrated. Mental health emergencies overwhelmed cities. Violence spread between those seeking emotional freedom and those terrified of losing societal structure entirely. The old system was dying. But no one yet knew what would replace it. Elias looked across the room. Fear lived in every face, but so did hope, and perhaps humanity had never learned how to carry both at the same time. We were taught, Elias began slowly, that human value comes from productivity, from status, from wealth. We were taught to compete with each other until loneliness felt normal. The room remained silent, but loneliness was never natural. He glanced toward the children sitting beside elderly residents. Human beings survived history through connection, through shared suffering, shared joy, shared meaning, not through endless consumption. A man near the back stood suddenly. And what if society collapses because of this? He demanded. What if Lucien is right? Fear spread instantly through the room. Elias didn't answer immediately. Because part of him feared the same thing. Finally, he spoke honestly. Maybe collapse was already happening, he said quietly. We just hid it behind luxury. No one moved. No one breathed. Outside, sirens echoed through distant streets. Then Sophia stepped beside him. Her voice was softer than his, but somehow stronger. Freedom without compassion becomes chaos, she said. But control without love becomes slavery. She looked across the room with tears in her eyes. This movement was never about destroying civilization. She gestured gently toward the people around them. It was about remembering humanity before we forgot ourselves completely. Several people began quietly crying, not dramatic crying, the kind buried inside people for years. Later that night, Elias sat alone on the sanctuary rooftop, while rain soaked the city beneath endless neon light. Helicopters moved across the skyline like mechanical insects. The world felt suspended between awakening and collapse. Footsteps approached behind him. Lucien Vale emerged from the shadows beneath an umbrella, perfectly composed despite the storm. Elias didn't react. You always appear when things become catastrophic, he muttered. Lucien stood beside him, overlooking the city. Because catastrophe reveals truth. Rain dripped from the rooftop edges far below. For a long moment neither spoke. Then Lucien finally said, "You still think this system was built out of greed alone?" Elias turned toward him coldly. "You engineered emotional dependency." "Yes," Lucien answered calmly. "Because emotionally fulfilled people stop consuming at profitable levels." The honesty stunned even Elias. Lucien continued. "Do you know what happens when millions suddenly lose consumer identity structures? Depression, violence, existential panic. Most people never developed souls outside economic validation." He looked down toward the chaotic city. "You awakened them before preparing them." Elias felt anger rise again. "You manipulated humanity into emptiness." "No," Lucien replied quietly. "Humanity begged for distraction. We simply industrialized desire." The words landed like poison because part of Elias feared they contained truth. Lucien studied him carefully. "You think people want freedom," he said. "Most people want comfort, predictability, escape from themselves." "And what do you want?" Elias asked. Lucien's expression darkened almost imperceptibly. to prevent civilization from emotionally tearing itself apart. For the first time, Elias saw exhaustion beneath the billionaire's calm exterior, not evil, fear. The fear of a man who believed humanity could not survive without psychological control. Lucien turned toward him fully. Your movement has already destabilized global behavioral systems. Consumption indexes are collapsing, productivity structures are failing, identity models are fragmenting. Rain intensified around them. Then Lucien said the sentence that froze Elias completely. We ran the projections years ago. Elias stared at him. What projections? Lucien's eyes remained steady. What happens if humanity wakes up? Lightning illuminated the skyline behind them. And according to the data, Elias whispered. Lucien looked toward the burning city lights below. Civilization survives only if humanity learns compassion faster than chaos. Then he walked away into the rain. The next morning, Lucien Vale appeared on every screen across the world. And for the first time in modern history, he released classified psychological research proving that modern civilization itself depended on engineered insecurity, emotional dissatisfaction, and endless consumer identity reinforcement. The revelation shattered global trust instantly. Markets crashed, governments panicked, cities erupted into uncertainty. And suddenly, humanity faced the most terrifying question it had ever known. If people stopped defining themselves through consumption, who would they become? The collapse did not arrive as fire or war. It arrived as a silence. Stores stayed open, but few entered. Offices still lit their towers at dawn, but half the desks remained empty. Digital marketplaces continued to function, yet the fever of consumption, the restless hunger that had once driven entire generations, began to fade like a dream people were no longer willing to chase. Elias stood at the edge of a small sanctuary field on the outskirts of what used to be a corporate district. The glass skyscrapers in the distance no longer looked powerful. They looked abandoned, like monuments built for a species that had forgotten why it built them. Beside him, Sophia placed a wooden bowl of food into the hands of an elderly woman. No transaction, no receipt, no exchange of worth, just giving. That simple act still felt revolutionary. Across the field, children played barefoot in the grass while volunteers prepared shared meals under open tents. The air smelled of soil, cooking rice, and rain-soaked wood. For the first time in years, Elias noticed something absent from his body: urgency, not the productive kind, the survival kind. Lucien Vale had disappeared from public view after the global disclosure. Some said he went into hiding. Others said he never existed as a single man, but as a coordinated system of influence that simply dissolved once exposed. The truth no longer mattered as much as what remained. Humanity was rebuilding, not perfectly, but honestly. Sophia sat beside Elias on a worn wooden bench overlooking the field. Her hands were no longer trembling. The exhaustion in her face had softened into something quieter, peace but earned. "They're learning again," she said softly. Elias nodded. "Not learning," he corrected gently. "Remembering," because that was what it felt like, as if humanity had once known how to live and had simply been taught to forget. In the distance, a group of former corporate workers struggled clumsily to repair irrigation systems. They argued, laughed, failed, tried again. No manager, no hierarchy of worth, only shared effort. Failure was no longer humiliation. It was participation. That alone changed everything. Months passed like that, then years. The sanctuary network expanded into something no longer hidden. Entire cities reorganized into cooperative living structures. Abandoned financial towers were transformed into community centers, libraries, healing halls. Glass walls that once reflected ambition now reflected children painting murals over corporate logos. Sophia's dream slowly became reality. She stood one evening inside the first official home of return, a space built for abandoned elderly citizens and orphaned children to live together. There was no separation of usefulness anymore. No ranking of value, only presence. She watched as an old man taught a child how to fold paper birds, and for the first time, Sophia cried without pain. Elias approached quietly behind her. "You built it," he said. "We built it," she corrected. A long silence passed between them, not empty but full. Their relationship had changed over time. It was no longer defined by urgency, fear, or shared rebellion. It had matured into something more fragile and more permanent. Understanding. They were no longer trying to complete each other. They were simply walking alongside one another, through a world learning how to breathe again. That evening, Lucien's final recorded message resurfaced in hidden archives and was quietly shared among communities. No apology, no defense. Only a reflection. Civilization was never broken by corruption alone, his voice said calmly. It was broken by emptiness people learned to call normal. Elias listened once, then never again. Because blame no longer solved anything. Healing did. The question that had once defined their entire struggle, whether humanity could survive without engineered desire, had transformed. It was no longer theoretical. It was visible in the soil, in the laughter, in the shared meals, in the way strangers now looked at each other without suspicion. Not perfect, but real. One morning, Elias walked alone through a rebuilt sanctuary marketplace. The sky was soft with early sunlight, touching everything with a warmth that no advertisement could ever replicate. Vendors didn't sell, they shared. Musicians played without stages. Children ran between tables where food was freely offered. Elias moved quietly through it all, no longer recognized as anything important. That anonymity felt like liberation. A small child tugged at his sleeve. "Sir?" the child asked. Elias knelt slightly. The child looked up with curiosity untouched by cynicism. Was it true people once worked so much they forgot how to love each other? Elias froze. Behind the child, laughter rose from a nearby table where strangers were feeding each other like family. An old woman brushed flour from a young man's hands. Someone offered water without being asked. The world was still healing its memory. Elias followed the child's gaze toward the horizon where, far in the distance, faint outlines of the old glass towers still remained, not destroyed. Just irrelevant, he searched for the right words. The answer existed, but it was too large to fit into language. Finally, he whispered, "Yes." The child tilted their head. Why? Elias looked again at the horizon, at everything humanity had once mistaken for success, and for a long moment he said nothing, because the truth was not simple. It was heavy. It was painful. It was shared. "I don't know if we forgot," he said quietly, "or if we were taught to forget." The child nodded as if both answers made sense, then ran back toward the laughter. Elias remained standing alone for a moment longer. A soft wind moved through the marketplace, carrying the sound of life, not driven, not optimized, not measured, just lived. Behind him, Sophia watched from a distance. She did not call out. She simply observed him the way one observes something finally healed after a long illness. Elias turned back toward her. And for the first time in his life, there was nothing left to fix, only something left to protect. The sunlight grew stronger. And somewhere beyond the fading skyline, the world continued learning how to become human again.